to our 12th confab. It's hard to believe that we've done 12 of these since the pandemic started. But today is a really important one that I'm hoping that those of you who've joined us here will be able to interact more than we have kind of in the past. So kind of going back to our original model of confab being kind of a conversation or a Q&A kind of session. And today we're going to be talking a lot about disposition of state archaeological collections, and not in the sense of like total deaccession, but in cases where we have a lot of redundant information or a lot of redundant artifacts or fossils that could be used in an educational setting most appropriately than taking up space in our facilities, in our museums and repositories. Before we begin, I thought I'd kind of go a little bit into sort of a presentation slash information session about what we're talking about here, and sort of the process of determining what kind of collections may be viable, that are redundant, that could have a better use outside of the museum or repository. And all of this sort of relates to the National Park Service issuing its addendum to 36 CFR 79 standards on the disposition of federal collections. The state collections policy is modeled after that, and we have actually already kind of tested it to a certain degree with the Camp Creek project that happened in Colorado Springs. And that particular project, which happened a couple of years ago, there were some collections that the museum wanted to, that they had a lot of redundant artifacts that they wanted to give to the Palmer House, which is a nonprofit group that runs tours of one of the mansions there from William Palmer. And so we had to develop some sort of policy or procedure, I should say, in order for that to occur. And so it's kind of been tested out there, and we've also tested it out in a couple other instances. In another instance, there was an archaeological project that was going on, and they had a lot of excess like nails and other things that just weren't going to fit into the repository. And the tenants of this particular building wanted to use some of those materials for educational purposes. And so we also developed this policy, again, very much mirrored after the federal policy as well. So let me just kind of begin by kind of starting out with a little short presentation. Hopefully you all can see that here. And before we actually sort of formally begin, as we do with all of our confabs and presentations, we would like to do a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land currently known as Colorado has been the traditional homelands of indigenous peoples since time immemorial. We are grateful for the work in partnership with the 48 sovereign nations who continue to call this land home. Together we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs to share the history of Colorado. Stay tuned. We're going to try in our next confab to look at some virtual exhibit options, things like ArcGIS story maps and things like that. So haven't got a set date yet, but if you do get the Curation Notes newsletter, look for that next announcement, hopefully soon, in the next couple months or so. So that will be on tap coming soon. So to begin with, I just kind of wanted to talk a little bit about the collecting artifacts flowchart that I kind of put together. This is based upon the Department of Defense's field guide and standards for collecting on Department of Defense properties, basically. But I think it's a pretty good flow chart of how collections are collected in the field, and then kind of what do you do with the excess things. So this policy not only helps with excess redundancies that you have in the repository, but it's really mostly to address issues of field archaeologists who have come back into the lab and they are about ready to do the curation procedures to deposit it to a museum, and they find that they have a whole bunch of extra stuff that the museum may not want. So, normally you start out in the field, you get a permit from the state, you get a curation agreement or an intent to curate those collections. It's very important that you talk and have conversations with the folks who are doing that that work, that you sign a curation contract or have a written document on what will be collected, so a collection strategy. And of course you do the actual collections subsurface testing, and then you might screen the soils from the test units, document all field methods, and then you may sample redundant sets of archaeological materials when called for in a research design, or retain a predetermined percent sample of those redundant materials, or for only those portions that will provide further identification. And then you might leave a predetermined percentage of material samples unprocessed for use in future studies as well. So then you have the excess materials that you need to deal with. So that's what this policy is all about. And this sort of comes from, or is the authority is in our rules and procedures, and of course with the exception of approved repatriation, repositories can't sell, transfer, assign, pledge, encumber, discard, or otherwise dispose of state collections or any part thereof, and that includes both the artifacts or fossils themselves as well as the accompanying documentation or any state of Colorado property in its possession without written and signed permission from the state archaeologist. So that does have to occur before any kind of transfer or disposal can occur. The Department of Defense has in their field guide a whole category of collecting guidances about what kinds of artifacts and materials that should be collected and how they should be sampled. This is very particular to the Department of Defense, but generally speaking, of course, a lot of field research is going to have a predetermined research design, so that it's going to be trying to answer some specific questions, and therefore a written contract or agreement with the repositories should be in place, determining how and what will be sampled. And generally speaking, all diagnostics should be collected, particularly if they, and usually always relate to the site that's being investigated. I do kind of want to give a plug for a book. If you haven't gotten a hold of the Using and Curating Archaeological Collections by Terry Child and Mike Warner, I highly recommend it. There's a couple chapters in there that are quite relevant to this discussion. One of which is Deaccessioning Federal Collections by Terry Childs. And the other is a really important one about the value of a lot of historic archaeology, and how sometimes you need to make really considered and well thought out and planned execution of a collection strategy for historic materials. So I do highly recommend this book if you can get a hold of it. It's published by the SIA Press. With that, I thought what I would try to do at this point in time is kind of go through the different policies and share with you that. So if you haven't seen the policies, I'm going to put that in the chats here. And I see that Rebecca said, do you have a similar chart for surface collecting? I do not have something similar, but in general, it would be somewhat the same as excavations if you're collecting. So I hope that helps. So this is the policy itself, which I'm going to pull through as well, pull up as well. And in addition to that, there is our disposal form, which I am going to also share with you here. If I can get back to it. And our transfer form. So I think you have everything there. So why don't I go ahead and pull up the first one there. So if you haven't gotten a hold of that one, which is our policy document, thought we'd run through that with you. I'm going to pull it up on my screen here while we do so. Okay. Can everybody see the guidelines? I hope. Okay. So these guidelines, as I said, are modeled after the 36 HIVAR 79 addendums. There is a little bit more streamlined approach with the state collections. The federal collections, which I won't go into, but I will also put a link to give you in the chat here, follow very much the same procedures, except for the fact that there is a couple more steps that are provided under federal regulations. Notice has to be published about disposals, and there is a collections committee that is convened. If there are more public, there is a bit more public involvement or opportunities for public involvement, and then if there are huge disputes, they are tried to be addressed, and then they're republished in the federal notice, and then finally the decision is made. So other than that, they're quite similar. But basically, the guidelines basically are ones in which do not apply at all to entire collections, and they do not apply to anything that would be considered or defined as cultural items or human remains or Native American Graves and Repatriation Act materials or anything of that sort. These do not apply in any way. And then the guidelines talk about the collection strategy. That is emphasized basically with every curation agreement that we send out that is given by History Colorado in our office. But we emphasize that, you know, the researchers really should try to have a good field research design if they're collecting materials, and it's most appropriate to have that under a contract if they're going to be doing extensive testing or excavation, and so that everybody knows what is going to be collected. So there should be no surprises on the museum side or the repository side, and the researchers have a clear understanding of how and what they're collecting. So the policy goes under some key terms of what ancillary samples are. Ancillary samples are basically your charcoal. It can be considered soil samples, coprolites, floral, faunal materials, things that are kind of ancillary to the artifacts or the site itself. Those have always been considered kind of separate from artifacts in and of themselves, and there really isn't necessary to have permission from the state archaeologist to do destructive analysis or anything like that with ancillary samples. And if there's ever a question about what is an ancillary sample, you can always contact our office and we can try to help determine that. But basically an artifact is any portable objects made or used by humans in the past, and diagnostic artifacts are defined as artifacts that possess characteristics of a specific time period and or culture. Artifacts that are non-diagnostics are those that lack those characteristics. Fossils are also defined in our rules and procedures, but fossils here mean traces of an organism or assemblage of organisms preserved or natural processes of the earth, or the Earth's crust, exclusive of organisms that have been buried in recent times. And we talk about paleontological resources, meaning fossils or other remains of prehistoric animals and plants. And prehistoric means time before written records were used to document events in Colorado. The principal investigator here is defined as a person permitted or qualified to lead a research investigation as defined in the state rules and or accepted waiver by those qualifications. So basically, we talked about ancillary samples as not being applicable to this, but who may propose a disposal of artifacts or fossils? Basically, professionally trained staff, conservative curators, directors, collection managers, and the principal investigators from current permitted organizations or individuals with verifiable knowledge working under the oversight of a PI can make that determination. However, the signing authority for that should be, and it has to be, the PI, and also it must be the director of the museum or the repository. And that's who is responsible for the disposal of those artifacts. So if you manage the collection, but you still are overseen by a superior, that person, that director, or top management official should be the one who signs off on that. When our particular remains considered to be non-curatable, they would be considered non-curatable when on a case-by-case basis that at least one qualified permitted archaeologist or paleontologist, we're talking about a PI, and one museum repository official with experience in the type of materials remains being evaluated and documented demonstrates that the disposition of any non-diagnostic material remains or fossils will not negatively impact the overall integrity of the original collection removed. So that's key number one. At least one of the following three requirements: lack of provenience information, lack of physical integrity, or overly redundant and not useful for research are met. These are the same definitions in the federal regs. Basically, lack of provenience information would be that you have materials that are lying around in the repository. These are kind of after the fact. Labels are not adhering to the materials. It's just these are materials that we have absolutely no idea where they came from, basically. The labels on the artifacts, the labels on the bags themselves that hold the artifacts are also been lost through time, or their associated records, and that the associated records of those artifacts or fossils have been lost or destroyed. It can't not be recovered. So that's part one: provenience information. Lack of physical integrity, artifacts that really lack further study capabilities, those that may be damaged through decay or decomposition over time, and that could be caused by human-caused agents or natural disasters, perhaps, and that determination is most likely going to become heavily from the museum side and maybe a conservator or two. Overly redundant and not useful for research, and this is the important part here. Disposition using this criteria must be carefully considered. It's defined as duplicated artifacts or fossils in such high quantities that the number of artifacts or fossils considered for disposition would not harm the intellectual knowledge lost by retaining a smaller representative sample of the whole population. So, and then there's a big note here that we've put in to determine that artifacts or fossils are overly redundant or non-diagnostic and not useful for research must be carefully considered. The archaeological context, research questions, and research potential, of course, may vary, so it is highly recommended to retain a representative sample for future research. So bulk samples in the lab or in the field also may be considered for insufficient interest when on a case-by-case basis the same criteria has been met. And the manner of transfer disposal, always follow and explore this order of options. So for anything regarding disposition of non-diagnostic materials, transfer to another nonprofit educational cultural organization, Indian tribe, or governmental agency. Another entity donation, name the organization, and there really has to be a kind of public benefit. It can't go to just Joe Blow who may be inappropriately using those collections. And destruction would be the absolute final choice. And you should describe how that process should happen. It's important to have an administrative record of that disposition, and it's required. So the state-approved repository must retain an administrative record of this disposition actions. I had an initial draft of this policy that it had to be in perpetuity, but I was told by the Attorney General's office that I couldn't put perpetuity. That was too long of a time period, even though, as I explained, we often look at things that are over 100 years old. But he said put a minimum of 100 years old, and hopefully there is a understanding that that's perpetuity. So there you have that. The administrative record then should include specific information such as a description of the evaluation, the methods of disposition, the names and titles of the persons initiating and approving the disposition, and the date of disposition. Any field or relevant catalog numbers and evidence of its receipt or transfer. Photographic documentation, we did that with the Camp Creek collection, which was very helpful. And the name and location of the recipient institution. So the administrative record must include the collection deposited associated records as well, if that's part of that. After disposition, the accession and catalog numbers must be reviewed and amended through the procedures established by the approved repository, and the amendments must identify the artifacts or fossils that were deaccessioned or disposed of, and the date of disposition. So a form is required if you're going to follow this procedure, and that is the state archaeologist's disposition form. It has to be signed, as I've said, by the head of the museum or the repository, as well as a principal investigator who is knowledgeable about the collection or the area. And then that has forwarded over to the state curation coordinator, who then forwards it on to the state archaeologist for final authority signature. So that is required. And then if it's transferred, a receipt form is required. So again, we know that it was accepted and it is where it was supposed to go. So items for repatriation or burial, all items that I've mentioned earlier that are related to NAGPRA or part of our unmarked human remains do not apply in this case at all, and those types of materials must be reported and approved by the state archaeologist under separate sort of circumstances. So there is a kind of key mark here at the end about non-repatriated artifacts and fossils for reburial consideration. Basically, as a general rule, our office does not condone the reburial of artifacts on state of Colorado or a subdivision of state Colorado lands, and certainly would not do so without proper permission granted by the state archaeologist. And doing so without documentation really would disturb the existing context of the site and create problematic deposits for future researchers. And then we list a couple of ethical grounds related to that. The Society for American Archaeology, as well as the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists and the state and the Society for Historical Archaeology's principles. So we've had quite a few requests and by consulting firms if they had the permission to just rebury, in some cases, some diagnostic artifacts, and generally speaking, we do not. Although there has been cases like working at the Amache site, for instance, which is a sacred site, and they are well documenting things that they find on the field and reburying them appropriately and with good documentation, and that is an approved action. So with that, I know that was about longer than I really kind of wanted to go all through that, but I kind of want to open up the floor at this point in time to talk with all of you about that process and try to answer questions about it. So if anybody would like to open up, or you can also type a question in the chat as well. Any questions? Was that all straightforward? Hopefully this is not, this is not an ordinary circumstance. These dispositions, they would be, hopefully not happening very often. We certainly don't want to see them very often, and hopefully with better planning by the paleontologists and the archaeologists who are out in the field who are doing permitted work, this isn't a big issue, or becomes less of an issue over time. Yeah, Bill.
Hey, Todd, good to see you in person.
Great.
As you know, with our repository situation, we're looking at going through the steps to take that balance and offer it to institutions. My question is, what does the state archaeologist, not that we have this situation, but what is actually disposition and destruction, and what's your definition exactly? Is that simply, we've got too much of one thing, so we throw it in the trash after going through all those steps, or is it actual destructive, like we're going to eliminate it, we're going to grind it up or something?
Right.
But what is your definition, or at least the NPS definition of that?
Well, with destructive analysis, that kind of just brings us to a request that happens quite often, which is with archaeologists wanting to do destructive analysis for like radiocarbon dating or something like that. Sure. And so that's what we're talking about in terms of destruction. And it's pretty defined in that regard. So we don't condone any other type of destruction, only
Sure.
for scientific purposes. But generally speaking, when we're talking about redundancies and numbers and stuff like that, that's going to be on a case-by-case basis, obviously. But a good example would be they've collected 300 nails, and they're not unique to the first 50, and so
right. That's kind of the position we're in with the Bromley artifacts, is that there's so many teeth from plows that
right. So definitely we highly recommend keeping a good representative sample, and then working with an archaeologist, a permitted archaeologist who has PI credentials, or someone who works under that who will sign off on it, that can say, okay, well, I think these are the best examples to keep. If you need space, then these could be donated to other educational purposes. So
And that's where we're at, because we had Maryland here.
Right.
But I just wanted to make clear, because, you know, what conditions would be that we would, you know, depart from the, you know, part of the collection and offer it. And we're still working with getting those given to another institution. So
Good. Excellent.
absolutely. Thanks for answering my question.
Yes. And I've got some other questions here in the chat, so let me get to those. Rebecca says, how many in the group are dealing with the potential of having a deaccession collection currently? Great question. Certainly you heard from Bill Armstrong. They're in Brighton. They're dealing with that. Anyone else?
We're not dealing with deaccessioning state specimens, but we are dealing with deaccessioning specimens that are in the Dinosaur Ridge collection. And for that reason, I like the policy that you have set up and the reasoning behind it. And with Amanda, I think, would agree that we should follow those same policies for our own collection.
Great.
I think it's done very well.
Great.
I have a question about
Sure.
We're in a situation where we don't really have contracts for collecting. People just bring things in. And if they've collected them from state property, how do we go about deciding whether we really want it or not? It's sort of pre-deaccessioning. If it's something that's not useful.
Yeah, so your collections policy should kind of state, and basically your repository approval status as for like the Friends of Dinosaur Ridge, which basically has the forgive me on the correct natural history, natural landmark designation area. Yeah, that's pretty much your core area that you would be able to collect from. And so anything outside of those boundaries, and if it's on state property, I would ask you to refer those to somewhere else, probably like the Golden History Museum, or maybe DMNS if they have room, somebody like that. So yeah, that would be the first kind of
Sure. Yeah, we've got a limited area that we're aware of.
But you can.
My question is about something. Let's say it's because most of what we deal with is state property. So if someone brings a fragment of a plant fossil that is of no value, but they got it on the ridge, and we turn it down, what do we do with it?
Well, that potentially, if you've accepted it, right, then.
I want to know how to make that decision. Do I accept it? Do I have to accept it?
You don't have to accept it. No, you do not have to accept it. So that's number one. Number two, if you do take it and you later decide this is not of value, then you would follow the procedures that have been outlined here. Yeah, but no, there's no obligation for you, unless you have a curation agreement with a paleontologist in that area that's doing work. There's no obligation necessarily for you to accept anything.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Could you clarify, so for state specimens, we have to get the state archaeologist approval to deascension them. What about stuff just within our collections that isn't a state specimen?
Anything that's like non-state collections, you mean?
Yes.
Those would be completely your running policy. So,
Okay.
if they're not from the state of Colorado lands, or they're not from Jefferson County, or from city of Morrison or Golden, or whatever it may be, a subdivision of state lands, then those rules don't apply. So it would be your policy, your internal policies.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, can I just add to that?
Yes.
That also make sure that if whoever does own them, if they are some sort of relationship with another, if it's like a loan or something like that, or whatever, long-term loan, etc., that you follow that policy too. So whoever, like, however you got that particular specimen, that will dictate what policies you should be using.
Thank you.
Yeah. Can I also make another comment, Todd?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Something I wanted to just kind of mention as well in regard to like the destruction conversation. Another word, another D word to keep in mind is disposal of the materials, which is a different conversation than destruction, right? So if you do decide to deaccession, you get approval, that the disposal piece will be that conversation that under and be included in that approval. And so the example that was used by Bill in terms of like throwing away all the extra nails, there's good ways and bad ways of doing that as well. And the same goes for any sort of collections, regardless of his nails or prehistoric lithics and such, in the event of trying to not create potential new archaeological finds. So like going and like digging a hole in the backyard of something or whatever, not probably the best idea. Or if, you know, say through some sort of tribal consultation, for example, they request that the materials be returned to a site or something like that. Sometimes we'll suggest like putting it in like a riverbed, a channel to allow natural taphonomic processes to allow like the distribution of materials as opposed to like potentially creating a new archaeological.
Correct. Yeah.
Right. Obviously, anything that's you want to try and reassign it to a public institution. Absolutely.
Sure.
First and foremost, yes.
First and foremost,
right.
and
Yeah, exactly.
you know, I mean, it came up as a question between one of my supervisors and myself. Actually, she's on this call about what that looks like. Not that we would do it in this case, but I was wondering in the context of archaeological material, you know, what that is. And, you know, this generates another question, you know. There are tenants out currently at the site, and they do find things. And I know Louis had a question. We're in a similar boat. Do we have to save those?
Yeah, hopefully you want to make sure that your volunteers are keeping things in the ground as much as possible, and only if like they feel like, and it's really hard to, you know, Rebecca and I have had this discussion with other like state parks and stuff too, where volunteers feel like, you know, it's completely threatened. If they didn't pick it up, then some other volunteer will be taking it and taking it home with them. And, you know, sometimes it's really difficult for volunteers to make that determination easily. I think, and particularly if it can't be put back and you don't know for exactly where it came from, and you feel like it isn't safe to leave it where it was, then collecting it is the most ethical thing to do, and it is appropriate to do that. So indeed, you should be collecting it and documenting it as much as you can, and so forth. And, you know, if you find out that it's a redundant item and you think that maybe it would be better served as an educational piece for the collection, then, you know, that would be okay too. Just let us know that that's the case, and you know, you don't really need to necessarily go through this process if you're keeping it within your own organization. But if
it's you know, we're talking about 120 years of agricultural, you know, waste from household and car parts and tractor parts and nails, right, and glass,
and that's going to be persistent throughout the whole
yeah. Oh yeah. So okay,
yeah,
it's good to know. Thank you for answering that.
Yeah. Any other questions? As I said, this is a piece, you know, of guidance that I've been working on for a long time. I've had both archaeologists and paleontologists have looked at this policy, as well as our Attorney General office. We made some slight changes from when the last curation notes went out, and we're going to try to get a little bit better approvals from the state archaeologist and our society board, so that it kind of gets a good record of that authority from the board of directors. But it's beyond that, it's ready to go as a policy. So, and we're already using it in one instance. So we'll see how that goes. But I think it's a sound policy. It's one thing that was really needed. A lot of folks have asked for this over the years, and we've tried to figure out a way to do it. And now it's a streamlined, I think, a good process that we can follow. And again, it follows the federal guidelines very closely. So. Any other thoughts or questions?
Thank you for doing that. I think that's at first glance, that is a good looking policy.
Thanks, Lou. It took a little while to get
I'm
to
sure
the where
it
it is.
did.
Again, as we said, we don't expect this to be used regularly, but certainly when you come to situations where, it's a collection that, gosh, we have a ton of nails or we have a ton of soil samples that we've inherited over the years. What can we do with them? How can we reduce that size and number in an appropriate manner, in a legally and ethical way? So that's what the policy is designed to do. It's also designed to help researchers who are working in the lab doing their analysis, and they have a ton of redundant nails or a ton of redundant fire crack rock. How much fire crack rock do we need, or do we want all of it? Those are pretty hard decisions, and we can't always answer them black and white, and it's going to be a case by case situation according to the research design, according to the area in which they're working. It's those are kind of difficult kind of conversations to have, but certainly we're here to help try to answer those questions as well. So if anybody's having issues with working with a researcher or research group that has been doing analysis and they're collecting a ton of things and you're just not quite sure how that's all going to fit into the repository, we're willing to try to help kind of mitigate that, or try to be the point at which we can also offer our recommendations as well. So, and then, hopefully this process can alleviate those bottlenecks before it gets completely put into the repository. All right, well, gosh, this is, we're hitting a record time here for our confab. If you have any other questions or thoughts about it, and again, I know most of you haven't really done this, but if you're, planning a collections move, you're moving the repository or the museum in the future, and you're trying to, make room, and, this policy has to be really adhered to. Can't just throw things away. It needs to be approved by the state archaeologist before that can occur, particularly if it relates to anything that's related to state of Colorado property. So, but hopefully this policy helps to guide that and gives good authority to both the museum collections staff as well as an archaeologist working in the area as well, to give some feedback and some recommendations too. Okay. Well,
Thanks for presenting.
We're going to end up early here, so if you have any other questions, you know how to reach me, and I do appreciate all of you and your time today, and look forward to another confab coming up in the next month or two.
Thanks, Todd.
Thank you very much, Bill. All of you have a great day.